Hi, my name's Don Latarski, and thank you for joining me for lesson number 8 in Guitar Theory Illustrated. Today's lesson continues our discussion of the chromatic alteration of the intervals that are found in the major scale. In the last lesson, we found out how minor intervals are formed, and we looked primarily at the most important ones, minor third and minor seventh. Today we're going to see what happens when notes are taken further apart. The term they use, in other words, the quality that is associated with that spreading apart of the notes, is called augmented. Whenever we take any two notes apart, the interval becomes augmented, as long as we do it by 1/2 step. What happens when we take a major second interval and add one more to it? Well, some of you who are astute, if you look at the chart over here, and if I start again with an A note down there, and I take the 2 here, and I raise it up to here, it's going to be an augmented 2, or an augmented second. Again, it's probably more common to refer to it as a sharp 2 or a raised 2. You might hear it in all three of those different ways. Some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, we just learned that in the last lesson. That's a flat 3. Well, it is a flat 3 shape, but sometimes in music, it's referred to as how the second degree relates to this shape, not the third degree. When we got this shape from the third, we lowered the third down a 1/2 step. Here we're arriving at it from thinking a little differently. By raising the second up 1/2 step, by augmenting it, we're getting a sharp 2. Now, the compound version of the sharp 2 sometimes occurs in dominant chords. We're going to get to dominant chords later, so please stick with me on this. Sometimes the sharp 2 is referred to in a chord as a sharp 9. That's the compound version. Okay, these are a little bit rare. Let's get to some more common stuff. We're not going to have an augmented third because naturally in the major scale, there's a 1/2 step there. So if you augmented the third, you could theoretically do it, but if you did it, you would just end up at the 4th. So we can skip that one. However, the 4th scale degree, which you all know it as the 11th in its compound form, the 4th can be raised to create an augmented 4th. Here's the shape of a perfect 4th. If I take this note up a 1/2 step to here, it becomes a sharp 4, or a raised 4, or an augmented 4. You could call it that as well. Most of the time in music, it's actually called a flat 5. There are a few chords you will encounter that will have either sharp 4 or more commonly sharp 11 in their names. For example, major 7 sharp 11. Sometimes people play that chord. Here's my sharp 4. Now, as you can see, the sharp 4 and the flat 5 have the same shape. This is a good time to introduce you to the concept of tritone. Tritone means 3 whole steps, the distance of 3 whole steps. From the root up to this note, this augmented 4th, which you're going to learn, might as well learn it right now, this diminished 5th. The distance there is 3 whole steps, or a tritone. Some people call that El Diablo in Musica, which means the devil in the music. And it's the sound of the siren in Europe. Let's play some shapes of that. Now, you might be thinking, I don't need that. But actually, you need that a lot because it's in a lot of chords that are really important to playing contemporary music, such as dominant 7th chords. The last augmented interval I want to talk about is the 5th. Augmented 5. Sharp 5, raised 5. Let's check it out. So here's the shape of a perfect fifth, also known as the power chord. If we raise this up a half step, it becomes augmented. Here's power chord, sharp 5, augmented fifth interval. Where would we be without the augmented fourth, perfect fifth, and augmented fifth, right? So the sharp 5, the raised fifth, it's kind of an important sound, a little bit mysterious, a little bit sinister perhaps. It's not a real beautiful sound to most people's ears, but it does have its uses, especially in an augmented chord such as this, which they used a lot in the 50s for ballads. Let me put that chord up here real quick. Check out this C chord where the sharp 5 would be called a C augmented chord. You can just feel the tension in that. That's coming from that sharp 5. Can you spot the sharp 5 shape? Here it is right here. It's a modification to the perfect fifth, which would be down here normally. But here it is up here. That's all we need to talk about in relation to augmented intervals. The important ones, if I had to prioritize them, I would say the sharp 5 is the most important, followed by the sharp 4, which it usually shows up in music, in contemporary music, as a sharp 11. The one that shows up the least is the sharp 2 or sharp 9, although there's one chord made very famous by Jimi Hendrix, which we call dominant 7 sharp 9. There it is. Sharp 9 sound. Where would we be without the sharp 9 chord? The last interval we need to cover today is the diminished. That takes care of all 5 qualities of intervals: majors, perfect, minor, augmented, and lastly diminished. Now, out of all the intervals, by far the most common diminished one is the fifth. And when I actually referred to it a little bit earlier today. Take a 5, flat it by 1/2 step. There it is. That's the tritone shape again. So the tritone shape can have 2 different names, either sharp 4 or flat 5. They feel exactly the same on the guitar here, and they sound the same up here. But flat 5 is a more common designation to this shape than sharp 4. Now there's one more diminished interval, and it's kind of an unusual one. It does not come up very often, but I got to explain it. Diminished intervals typically are only formed from perfect intervals. So we can have a diminished fourth. Technically, we're not going to because it would land right on the third. But we can have a diminished fifth. We could have a diminished eighth, but there's no reason for that, is there? Because it would be the seventh. So the only real interval that becomes diminished typically is this one. However, the seventh can become diminished in one very rare circumstance, and it's when it's found within a diminished seventh chord, sometimes called a fully diminished seventh chord. So when we subtract a half step from the seventh, it becomes minor seventh or flat 7. Okay, so let's put that up there, flat 7. But if we subtract one more half step from it, it becomes a diminished seventh interval, usually represented by 2 flat signs like this. Now, to your fingers and to your ear, you're going to say, wait a minute, what are you trying to pull? This is a major sixth shape. And indeed it is. It's one of the vagaries of music theory. If you were to spell a fully diminished seventh chord correctly, that is, using notation, you would end up with an interval that would be called a diminished seventh. For our purposes, it's going to feel and it's going to sound like a major sixth. But you do need to know the difference in case somebody springs that on you someday and says, oh, I see you're playing a diminished seventh interval in that chord shape of yours, and you can nonchalantly say, oh yes, I use that quite often, just like George Harrison. Thank you. We'll see you again soon.